By the time German commanders realized that millions of Soviet citizens who had welcomed them as liberators had become their most dangerous enemies, the political decision that doomed Operation Barbarossa was already irreversible. The orders had been issued months before the invasion, written not by generals but by party ideologues who insisted that Nazi racial policy took precedence over military necessity. Hitler had explicitly commanded that the invasion of the Soviet Union would not be a conventional war but a racial war of annihilation where political ideology overrode every military consideration. This was not a battlefield error. It was a political directive that transformed potential allies into implacable enemies and made winning the Eastern Front strategically impossible regardless of how many tactical victories the Wehrmacht achieved. When German forces crossed the Soviet border in June 1941, they entered territory where millions of people despised Stalin's regime. The Ukrainian population had endured forced collectivization and the Holodomor famine that killed millions. Baltic peoples had suffered Soviet occupation and mass deportations only a year earlier. Russian peasants resented communist agricultural policies. Ethnic minorities faced systematic persecution. Religious believers of all kinds lived under state atheism. In many villages, German troops were initially greeted as liberators from communist tyranny. This was not propaganda. This was the genuine sentiment of populations that had suffered under Stalin's rule. Military intelligence officers reported that vast numbers of Soviet citizens were ready to actively support Germany if treated as allies rather than conquered peoples. This was Germany's strategic opportunity: exploit internal Soviet divisions to collapse the regime from within. On March 30, 1941, Hitler issued explicit orders to his military commanders that fundamentally changed the nature of the coming invasion. The war in the East would be a war of racial annihilation, not conventional military conflict. Soviet commissars were to be executed on capture. Civilian populations were to be treated as racially inferior. Normal rules of warfare did not apply. The invasion's purpose was not merely military victory but the destruction of Bolshevism and the enslavement of Slavic populations. These orders were not suggestions. They were mandatory directives from the Supreme Commander. Hitler made clear that any officer who objected lacked the ideological commitment necessary for the Eastern Campaign. The German military establishment, with rare exceptions, accepted these orders without serious protest. What should have been a conventional military campaign to destroy the Red Army became instead a political crusade that would create resistance where none needed to exist. Hitler's rationale for the racial war directive was rooted in Nazi ideology's core beliefs. The Nazi worldview held that the struggle against the Soviet Union was fundamentally racial rather than political or military. Bolshevism was seen as a Jewish creation designed to enslave Aryan peoples. Slavic populations were categorized as racially inferior and destined for subjugation regardless of their political views. Treating Soviet citizens humanely or exploiting anti-Stalin sentiment would legitimize Slavic peoples as equals, contradicting the racial hierarchy that Nazism taught. For Hitler, implementing racial policy in the occupied territories was not optional or secondary. It was the invasion's purpose. Victory meant not just defeating the Red Army but establishing racial domination. This ideological framework made the decision to wage racial war seem not just logical but necessary. Military professionals who suggested that treating populations decently would reduce resistance were dismissed as lacking ideological understanding. Not all German military officers accepted the racial war directives without objection. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock warned that brutalizing populations would create resistance that would require massive forces to suppress. General Johannes Blaskowitz had protested similar policies in Poland and was removed for his objections. Intelligence officers reported that Soviet citizens would support Germany if treated as partners against Stalin's regime. These warnings were professional military assessments based on practical considerations. Terrorizing populations would turn them into enemies. Executing commissars would make Soviet soldiers fight to the death rather than surrender. Starving POWs would eliminate potential collaborators. Every brutalization policy would create military problems that tactical skill could not solve. But Hitler rejected these warnings as evidence that professional officers did not understand the ideological nature of the struggle. The political directive stood unchanged, and officers who continued objecting were removed from positions of influence. Behind the advancing Wehrmacht came the Einsatzgruppen, special units tasked with implementing racial policy in occupied territories. Their mission was explicit: eliminate communist functionaries, execute Jewish populations, and terrorize civilians into submission. Simultaneously, German occupation authorities began implementing policies that treated Soviet populations as subhuman. Food was systematically diverted to Germany while occupied populations faced starvation. Able-bodied civilians were rounded up for forced labor in Germany. Villages suspected of partisan sympathy were burned with their inhabitants. Soviet POWs were deliberately starved in camps, with millions dying of hunger and exposure. These were not battlefield excesses or unauthorized actions by rogue commanders. These were the systematic implementation of political directives issued before the invasion began. Each action perfectly implemented Hitler's vision of racial war. Each action created enemies where potential allies had existed. Within months of the invasion, the initial welcome in many areas had transformed into hatred. Ukrainian villagers who had greeted Germans as liberators watched as German authorities requisitioned food, sent their young people to labor camps, and treated them as racial inferiors. Baltic populations who had hoped for restored independence realized Germany intended permanent occupation. Russian peasants who had expected relief from communist policies faced treatment worse than what Stalin had imposed. The transformation was rapid and total. Populations that might have provided intelligence, supplies, and even military recruits instead began hiding partisans, sabotaging German supply lines, and conducting resistance. Intelligence reports documented the change with alarm. Areas that had been pacified required increasing security forces. German administrators reported that occupation policies were creating enemies unnecessarily. But the political directives could not be changed because they flowed directly from Nazi ideology's core premises. By late 1941, partisan warfare had erupted across German rear areas on a scale that Wehrmacht planners had not anticipated. Soviet citizens who had initially remained neutral now actively supported partisan bands. The brutal occupation policies had unified populations that Stalin's regime had divided. Former Red Army soldiers who might have accepted capture instead melted into forests to continue fighting. Villages provided partisans with food, shelter, and intelligence about German movements. The resistance was not centrally organized initially, it was organic response to German policies that left civilians with nothing to lose. German security forces found themselves fighting an invisible enemy that had popular support. Brutal reprisals only intensified resistance. Entire divisions that should have been at the front were instead committed to rear security. The political decision to wage racial war was consuming military resources that the Eastern Front desperately needed. The treatment of Soviet prisoners of war represented the racial war policy's most catastrophic implementation. German directives specified that Soviet POWs were not protected by Geneva Convention standards and could be treated as ideologically dangerous elements. The result was systematic starvation and exposure in open-air camps. Of approximately 5 million Soviet POWs captured, over 3 million died in German custody. This was not logistical failure. This was deliberate policy implementation. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Red Army soldiers learned that capture meant death and fought with desperate ferocity rather than surrender. Soviet propaganda about German atrocities, previously dismissed by Soviet soldiers as exaggeration, proved accurate. The potential pool of anti-Stalin collaborators was deliberately eliminated. Military professionals argued that treating POWs decently and exploiting anti-communist sentiment would yield intelligence and potential auxiliary forces. But political directives insisted that racial enemies could not be treated as human beings, and millions died as a result. By 1942, the consequences of the racial war policy were visible in Wehrmacht force allocations. Over 500,000 German troops were committed to rear security operations against partisans. Entire divisions were dispersed across occupied territory fighting resistance that occupation policy had created. Railway lines required constant security against sabotage. Supply convoys needed armed escorts. Administrative centers needed permanent garrisons. These forces were not available for frontline operations. Meanwhile, the Red Army was rebuilding and preparing counteroffensives. German commanders at the front reported they lacked sufficient forces while hundreds of thousands of German soldiers fought partisans in the rear. This was not inevitable. It was the direct consequence of political decisions about population treatment. Had German policy sought to exploit anti-Stalin sentiment and treat populations as potential allies, those same populations might have provided local security, freeing German troops for the front. Instead, racial ideology demanded brutalization, and military necessity was subordinated to political doctrine. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens would have actively fought against Stalin's regime if German policy had allowed it. Russian émigré generals offered to raise armies of Soviet POWs and defectors. Ukrainian nationalists sought alliance against communism. Cossack populations requested autonomy in exchange for military support. Baltic units wanted to fight for independence. German military intelligence documented enormous potential for exploiting Soviet internal divisions. But Nazi racial ideology forbade treating Slavic peoples as equals or allies. Collaborator units that were eventually formed were treated as inferior auxiliaries and given minimal support. The potential for mobilizing millions of anti-communist Soviets against Stalin was deliberately rejected because it contradicted racial doctrine. Military professionals understood that a political strategy of liberation rather than subjugation would have fractured Soviet resistance. But such strategy was ideologically impossible for a regime committed to racial hierarchy. The opportunity to turn the Soviet Union's internal divisions into Germany's strategic advantage was sacrificed to maintain ideological purity. By mid-1942, the consequences of the racial war directive could not be reversed. Millions of Soviet citizens had direct experience of German brutality. Villages had been destroyed. Family members had been killed or deported. POWs had starved in camps. Partisan warfare had become entrenched. Most critically, Stalin's propaganda about German intentions had been validated by German actions. Soviet populations that had initially been divided now unified against a common enemy that treated them all as racial inferiors. German military governors who attempted more moderate policies were overruled by party officials enforcing racial directives. The political decision made in 1941 had created realities in 1942 that made changing course impossible. Even if Germany had reversed its policies, the damage was done. Populations would not trust new promises after experiencing systematic brutality. The strategic opportunity to exploit Soviet internal divisions had been permanently destroyed by political ideology's implementation. As the war continued, the partisan problem intensified rather than diminished. By 1943, partisan movements controlled large areas of occupied territory and conducted coordinated operations against German supply lines. German security forces responded with increasing brutality, which drove more civilians into active resistance. The cycle was self-reinforcing. Harsh security measures created more partisans. More partisans required more security forces. More security forces meant fewer troops at the front. Meanwhile, the Red Army was launching major offensives that German forces could not contain with available manpower. The racial war policy had created a strategic trap where Germany needed more forces than it possessed. Every division fighting partisans was unavailable for frontline combat. Every kilometer of railway required security. Every administrative center needed garrison forces. The Wehrmacht was consuming itself in a security nightmare that political ideology had created and military necessity could not solve. The contrast with German occupation policies in Western Europe demonstrated what different political decisions might have achieved in the East. In France, Denmark, and the Low Countries, German occupation was harsh but not racial in character. Populations were not systematically brutalized. POWs were treated according to international law. Collaboration was politically possible for those who chose it. The result was that resistance, while present, never reached the scale of Eastern partisan warfare. German security requirements in the West were manageable with limited forces. This was not because Western populations were more docile. It was because German policy did not systematically terrorize entire populations based on racial ideology. The comparison made clear that the partisan crisis in the East was not inevitable. It was the direct consequence of political decisions about how occupied populations would be treated. Military professionals pointed to this contrast, but Nazi ideology forbade applying Western occupation policies in the East because racial doctrine demanded different treatment for different peoples. By 1943, the Red Army was advancing while German forces struggled with impossible resource allocation. Frontline units reported they faced Soviet attacks with insufficient forces to hold defensive lines. Simultaneously, massive German forces were committed to rear security with no decisive result. The strategic situation was clear: Germany was fighting two wars simultaneously in the East. One was conventional military conflict against the Red Army. The other was counterinsurgency against partisan forces in occupied territory. Germany lacked sufficient military strength to win both. But the partisan war existed only because political directives had created it through brutal occupation policies. Had Germany treated Soviet populations as potential allies, those populations might have provided local security, intelligence, and even military auxiliaries. Instead, racial ideology had transformed them into enemies, and the Wehrmacht was being bled white fighting resistance that need not have existed. The political decision to wage racial war had created military requirements that Germany could not meet. The racial war directive was not an isolated error but reflected a consistent pattern where Nazi leadership subordinated military necessity to ideological imperatives. Professional military officers repeatedly argued that strategic success required pragmatic policies adapted to operational realities. Party ideologues insisted that ideological purity could not be compromised regardless of military consequences. This pattern appeared in economic policy, where ideological goals delayed total mobilization. It appeared in intelligence assessment, where racial prejudice prevented accurate evaluation of enemy capabilities. It appeared in occupation policy, where racial ideology transformed potential allies into enemies. Each time, ideology prevailed over military professionalism. Each time, the consequences were catastrophic. The racial war directive that doomed Barbarossa was simply the most consequential example of a broader dysfunction where the Nazi regime was structurally incapable of subordinating ideology to strategic necessity. Even as Germany's strategic situation deteriorated catastrophically, Nazi leadership never acknowledged that racial war policies had been strategically counterproductive. When military officers raised the issue, they were accused of lacking ideological commitment. Alternative policies that might have exploited Soviet divisions were rejected as racial compromise. The possibility that German occupation brutality had unified Soviet resistance was ideologically unthinkable. This was not merely stubbornness. It was the logical consequence of a worldview where racial hierarchy was foundational truth. Acknowledging that treating Slavic peoples decently would have been strategically beneficial required admitting that racial ideology was wrong. For Nazi leadership, this was psychologically and politically impossible. They could accept total defeat more easily than ideological error. And so the policies continued unchanged even as their catastrophic consequences became undeniable. The regime remained committed to racial war even as that commitment destroyed it. When the Red Army reached Berlin in 1945, it was fighting for a Soviet Union that German occupation policy had unified. Soviet soldiers who might have surrendered in 1941 fought to the death after learning what German captivity meant. Civilian populations who might have welcomed liberation supported Stalin's war effort after experiencing German occupation. Partisan movements that German policy had created tied down forces that might have held defensive lines. The strategic opportunity to exploit Soviet internal divisions had been destroyed by political decisions that insisted on racial war rather than conventional military conflict. Professional military officers had warned this would happen. Intelligence reports had documented the consequences. But Nazi ideology had demanded that political doctrine override military necessity, and millions died as a result. Operation Barbarossa was not lost because German forces were inadequate or Soviet resistance was stronger. It was lost because a political decision to wage racial war created enemies where allies might have existed and consumed military resources fighting resistance that brutal occupation policy had created. The invasion was unwinnable not because of what happened on battlefields but because of what was decided in Reich Chancellery offices before the first shot was fired.